Back in 2017, I made a video edited by Abi Kapoor from the cartoon Cypher called Anime the Global Medium. The purpose was to explore the growing amounts of international collaborations and the way in which they benefit anime both as a medium and industry. It was an optimistic video during what I thought was an optimistic time, but it also hasn't aged well in the slightest. Instead, 4 years later, while there have been exciting creations, and it is now easier to get new shows greenlit than ever before, it's also exacerbated so many of the industry's existing issues. This will be a reaction video, where I'll be commentating on parts of Anime the Global Medium. But to properly do a reaction video, I should turn on my facecam first. Cuter than you thought, right? But before I begin, this video is sponsored quite fittingly by Surfshark VPN. Anime is a global medium, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets easy access to all the anime that exist. I use VPNs a lot for YouTube and TV shows, and they're particularly perfect for services like Crunchyroll, Funimation, and Netflix. One of the most common complaints about Crunchyroll, in fact, is that there are many regions with a limited library. There have been movements towards trying to get global licenses, but there's always going to be some exceptions to that. Surfshark gets around regional restrictions in its form as either an app or browser extension, and it lets you browse the web as if you were in that country yourself. Click the link in the description and use the code Canipa for 83% off and 4 extra months free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So this video starts with a whole spiel about the international popularity of K-pop and a silly reference to a terrible American K-pop band that nobody ever liked, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Anyway, let's skip forward. Anime is a global medium. Not just in the way that people all over the world enjoy it, but in how it's been adopted as an aesthetic and how people have travelled miles to become a part of it. International licensing has become a huge part of how anime makes money, overtaking merchandise revenue in 2015, and enthusiasm for anime both within the US and China are huge parts of that. In fact, as of the most recent anime industry report, overseas revenue has now overtaken all revenue from Japan combined. This doesn't just mean that anime makes more money outside of Japan than within it, but that even the money that international licensors pay back to the industry tops all revenue from local sources. In 2014, it was less than 20% of the market. Now it's over 50%. This is a big change because it doesn't just mean that the anime industry is benefiting from overseas companies, but now they're relying on them. Especially China. It's important to talk about China in anime because that market is going to influence the future of anime as producers start talking not just about what would be appealing to those within the domestic market, but also putting an ever-increasing importance on those overseas. It turns out that the Chinese market didn't actually influence the future of anime in the way that we were thinking. Despite the fact that anime is hugely popular in China, government regulations made high-cost licensing and co-productions riskier. Instead, they kind of changed tact and created different types of international collaborations. One of the biggest is Yoestar. It's a game developer and publisher in China, but with a large branch in Japan, and in particular, there's Yoestar Pictures, an anime studio that creates popular animated trailers for their games, as well as the upcoming Arknight series. Some analysts predicted that we'd see more censorship to fit within the confines of the regulations, but instead, Chinese companies just started spending money in different places, making America the largest source of revenue within anime. That's set to increase even further as other major streamers like HBO Max and Disney Plus enter the industry. Although it is worth noting that Bilibili and other Chinese companies have been turning their attention towards Chinese donghua that are either based on or inspired by Japanese properties, like the upcoming 5,000-year herbivorous dragon donghua based on a Japanese light novel. So therefore, it's no surprise that international streaming services are taking the extra step. Instead of just buying licenses to stream the series, they're going straight to the source and aiding in producing it. For example, Bilibili helped produce both Idol Incidents and Akiba Strip, whilst Crunchyroll was on the production committee for Kemono Friends, Masamune-kun's Revenge, and many more. The only reason so many anime can be produced today is that companies from outside the traditional Japanese market are interested and represent the millions of fans that don't happen to live in Japan. This ended up being truer than I expected. More anime are being made as a result of both high-value licensing deals and co-productions. Crunchyroll actually went so far as to start calling some of these Crunchyroll Originals in 2019, mimicking Netflix's branding. This culminated in them working with Webtoon and Solar Entertainment to put together Tower of God and God of High School as Crunchyroll Original Series. This was kind of a step up from co-productions. Similarly, not only did they invest in 2019's Rising the Shield Hero, but Crunchyroll staff were actually the ones to suggest it gets adapted to begin with. For them, it's not just about co-funding popular shows, but getting them made in the first place. Problem is, not all of these anime should have been made. This year's X-Arm was a perfect example of producers wanting to have an anime made, but having no idea how to have it made. Studios are booked out for years, and so more and more often, these international collaborations end up going to teams that have little to no anime experience at all. And despite the amount of international funds going to these series, very little ends up making it back to those who have to be burdened with these unreasonable requests. There are increasing examples of anime made possible with support from overseas. But there's already endless examples of anime produced by people born overseas. You can go back to the 1990s when Michael Arias moved to Japan to direct Tekkon Kincrete, or you can talk about just this year where Korean animator Sejun Kim was selected to direct Gundam Twilight Axis. I think it's also worth mentioning that Jujutsu Kaisen, one of the most popular shows in Japan today, also has a Korean director, Sung-ho Park. There's also Toby and Akakiri from Star Wars Visions, directed by Spanish animator Ibon Gongora and Korean studio lead Un Young Choi respectively. With more foreigners in the production side of anime, it is likely that there will be more foreign directors in the future. I did an article for Anime News Network with the original title being The Anime Influences of Western Web Animators. The purpose of the article was to describe how animators today are using the internet to both find inspirations and publish their own work. And so I conducted a load of different interviews and concluded that anime will largely be influencing global animation from an aesthetic standpoint, because many of those learning animation are learning from Japanese artists online. So here's the funny thing, almost all of the animators that I interviewed for that went on to work on anime. It's actually become a big trend, but not in the way you might hope. Instead of bringing on international artists for their abilities, all too many shows use them simply as a way of getting a show finished while on a tight deadline. Which is seriously annoying because despite the talents of these international animators, this also often comes with the unreasonably low pay. In an interview with the Indonesian animator commonly known as Guzu, he said that he prefers not to work on anime anymore because he feels like his time is respected more outside of the Japanese industry. On anime, he said that he had very little time to sleep and was constantly stressed about the salary. Ultimately, it's an extension of the anime industry's current issues, but what's notable is that even when facing a labour shortage, production companies have been unwilling to change their abysmal rates. And just 1 month after that article was published was the announcement of the Castlevania Netflix series, an American production with huge 90s and 80s anime inspirations. Oh, and fun fact, Christian Maize, the animator who made my channel intro, worked on it. Amusingly, some people didn't even realise it was an American show, with some people believing it was produced at Studio Madhouse. With producer and director Adi Shankar mentioning that he was inspired by shows like Vampire Hunter D and Space Pirate Harlock, the use of the word anime as anything other than geographical identification appears all the more obsolete. Castlevania was huge for Netflix because they realised two things: that video game adaptations could become hugely popular and that they could create convincing anime overseas. I actually disagree with my statements here, since anime has turned more and more into a brand rather than a set of creative inspirations as they were in Castlevania. Monster Hunter Legends of the Guild was advertised as a Netflix original anime, despite looking more like Shrek than anything else. The thing is, Netflix and streaming services in general are desperate for content, and the popularity of anime has created a demand that has rapidly increased the amount of premium shows being created. So while anime studios are already taking on way too much work, Netflix had the ingenious idea to contact studios outside of Japan, whether that be South Korea, the United States, France, or even Denmark, and then label their shows as anime as well. Castlevania is somewhat of a lightning in a bottle. A bunch of incredible animators inspired by anime who created something that doesn't just pass the litmus test, but presents something visually unique as well. Instead of the creative legacy that I thought the word anime could signify, few managed to capture the magic that was Castlevania, and it ended up being just a marketing term years later. And then with Children of Ether, it was produced at Yapako Animation, a studio with ties to both the French animation industry and Japan, with studios in both countries. Meanwhile, it's storyboarded by One Punch Man director Shingo Natsume, and the world-renowned animator Mitsuo Iso provided animation for the project. Yapako Animation was an interesting idea, but the studio folded in 2020. After Children of Ether, they were tasked with creating shows for Crunchyroll Originals, based on a Warren Ellis comic and an original concept called Meiji Gekken. The French animation industry is and always has been incredibly exciting, so I was excited for Yapako by extension, but they struggled to adapt to Crunchyroll's requests and collapsed. With the closure of many Japanese animation schools, the anime industry is on a path towards global reliance. They will need to take more flights to foreign animation schools in Europe and America to find new talents to help create the increasing workload of anime in Japan. Or they could just DM anyone on Twitter who happens to have the word animator in their bio. A lot of animators who get offered and end up taking this work are young and inexperienced. It rarely ended up being a case of seeking out specific talented animators and teaching them the process, but instead just dropping them in the deep end. In some cases, it's burning out young animators before they've even had the chance to shine. And so, anime is a global medium. Its popularity worldwide has inspired both companies and individuals to want to become a part of what was once uniquely Japanese. And it's not like anyone wants to change it or mold it into something dramatically different, because those involved understand its inherent global appeal as a storytelling medium. At the time, this was a big concern, that anime would become Americanized, and that has been one approach. There are anime coming out based on Lord of the Rings, Blade Runner, Cyberpunk 2077, Super Crooks, Pacific Rim, that fucking Bright movie, and that's not including all the stuff made outside of Japan, like Splinter Cell, Tomb Raider, and Skull Island. These are established stories that are already popular in the West. Except Bright, of course. Most anime are still based on Japanese properties, since the majority of funding and creative control still comes from Japanese producers, but this has been a growing trend the last few years. It's also worth noting that since Netflix and Amazon pay so much for series, they end up ensuring their continuations, as Netflix's head of anime in particular says that they prefer to license, quote, edgy shows, programming that appeals to a global audience, like sci-fi and fantasy. So these can still be Japanese shows, but he specifically says that they have a harder time with slice of life and comedy, and therefore don't license as much of those. You can see that from the output of the world's biggest streaming service, and when they find something popular, they won't let it go. Despite the 7 Deadly Sins going from production disaster to production disaster and finally ending up as a CG anime, they're going to make sure that somebody keeps making it. The biggest issue with streaming services is that it doesn't matter if the individual shows are a disaster, as long as they're creating the impression that a subscription is valuable. Whether it's producing animation outside or inside Japan, it's something that anyone can be a part of, regardless of what country they happen to be born in. If you want to work in Japan, study your Japanese language skills, because you're going to want to talk to your co-workers. And if you want to stay where you are, just start creating. Put yourself out there and make what you love. This was my cheesy positive ending to the original video, and honestly, it's hopelessly naive on reflection. So here's another go at it. You don't have to work on anime, and you probably shouldn't rely on it to pay the bills. Anime is something that anyone can be a part of, but you should also understand your value and how much your time is worth. If you do want to accept anime work, then more experienced animators say that it's important that you make sure you understand the process and ask questions to the right people first. This is perhaps the glummest video I've made to date. It's not even like these problems are unique to the anime industry either. The Screen Union, IATSC, had to threaten the largest strike in American history to get better assurances for filmmakers who were having to put in longer hours to keep up with the massive demand from streaming services. Honestly, a lot of the really hopeful international projects are the smaller scale initiatives, like the Oto-chan show, created by artists around the world, and even though episodes take months to finish, it's an ethical production with a convincing end product. There is also, of course, Castlevania. It has a longer than average production time, and its directors have searched far and wide for great animators across the world, not just to get the job done, but to highlight their individual talents. As I mentioned before, it does feel like somewhat of a lightning in a bottle, but it can be done, and Castlevania has shown that it can be done for 4 seasons straight. Thanks for watching the Canipa Effect. Despite this being a pretty negative video, I still wanted to end it on a positive note. It is a great time to be an anime fan, but we should also be aware of the side effects of all of these high quality anime series we're seeing and what it takes to accomplish them. I'd like to give big thanks to the people who created my penguin avatar. The illustration was created by Nucky and it was rigged by Drock. You can find links to their brilliant work in the description. But before I go, I'd like to thank these incredible people for supporting the channel. In particular, I'd like to thank Alan Baquero, Austin Hardwick, Dedameat, Eddie Laheka, Edwin Shale, Faux Wizard, Frizzy Canadian, Frogkun, Fujay, Jacob Bosley, Jawburst, JR Pictures, My Own Mother, Naylor Drink, Nolan Soga, Quentin Elkin Smith, Ryan Taylor, and Tom Rahman.